Welcome to episode 10 of Psychedelic Divas. I am thrilled to have made it this far. Thank you so much for being on this journey with me. It means so much to have you along for this ride. This episode is a little different in that I am on someone else's podcast. It's my first podcast interview other than my own self interviews on Psychedelic Divas. My dear friend, Alan Levin, invited me on his podcast, Crossing the Boundary. I first met Alan in a Ralph Metzner circle, and we have been dear friends for decades now, sharing many deep transformational moments together, both on and off the mat. It was an honor to be featured on his podcast and to share tales of our time together with Ralph. Alan's connection with Ralph predates mine by many years, and it was fun to journey back in time together to reminisce about one of our most important teachers. I think you'll enjoy this episode, and it makes me so happy to promote the peace activist work that Alan does in the world. So I encourage you to explore other episodes of Crossing the Boundary. Thanks so much for listening.
Hello, welcome. This is Alan Levin, and in one of my intermittent podcast YouTube series, Crossing the Boundary, in which I have conversations or interviews with people who have made major shifts, boundaries, perhaps you could call them, that they've crossed in consciousness or spiritual orientation or identity. And also another qualifier is that they're doing something really good in this world, making the world a better place. So I'm delighted today to have a friend I've known for quite some time, Carla Detchen. Carla is a coach, called an integrative coach, and she is also a longtime explorer of the use of psychedelics. And she has now started a podcast called Psychedelic Divas, which she has recently launched. It's fascinating. I've watched several of them already myself. And her intention on this is to bring the feminine voice into the world of psychedelic as it exists in the world of psychedelics, and sort of strengthen that voice. It's tended to be a male-dominated area for as most areas. So anyway, here's Carla, and I want to ask you, Carla, if you would, to just say a little bit about where you all come from, where you were raised, what kind of a family it was. Was there an orientation toward spirituality, toward culture? What was life like growing up?
Well, first of all, Alan, thank you so much for having me on. And you're right, we have known each other many decades through many transformational processes, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. But so for me, growing up I grew up in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. I had intact parents, loving parents. I had an older sister, and I grew up really blessed. As I said, my parents were together till my dad died, and I was raised very privileged. And I was raised with the spiritual perspective was the Methodist church that was down the street. Although I have to say it never really landed for me. And apparently, well, there were some aspects about that church that were problematic. And just by being a nosy little kid, I think I knew more than I was supposed to know at age 12. But at age 12, when I was supposed to go be confirmed, I very sassily told my mother, why should I join a church where the minister is an embezzler and the Sunday school teacher is a pedophile? And I don't know if I knew the word pedophile, but I knew something, obviously.
Mm,
And both of those were true, and unfortunately. And
mm,
my mother did not know how to respond to that. And I did not have to be confirmed. And I think that says sort of a lot about my rebellious
Mhm.
nature. But I
Early,
also,
early rebellion, early rebeller, rebel.
but I rebelled within a very constricted, like I was a good girl. So like if she had said, doesn't matter, you're gonna get confirmed, then I would have gotten confirmed. My rebellion was very circumscribed. I was a good girl. I was a debutante. I was a sorority girl in college.
Mm,
I had a lot of, all the outer trappings of waspy upbringing and was scheduled to marry a doctor and have 2.5 kids and, live in Florida.
mm,
And so that's how I was raised.
mm. Wow. So there's something happened,
Something snapped.
and you've become Carla, psychedelic diva. So,
That was a journey. I mean, that was definitely that has taken me the last 40 years. So it was not just
mhm, sure, sure.
but
What
but
were
it
some of the
was
major shifts, would you say, or changes from the
um
transitions?
I think the first major shift was I moved to California after college.
What year was that?
I moved to California in January of 1985,
Oh, okay.
and I lived in San Francisco for 20 years.
Mhm,
And that living in San Francisco from 1985 to 2005 was incredibly formative and
mhm,
certainly made me, have more of a liberal, open-minded perspective. I, had a ton of gay friends. When I first came to San Francisco in 1983 for the summer after I graduated, I mean, the AIDS epidemic, they were just,
mhm,
putting words and language to it.
mhm.
We didn't know how it was transmitted. We ended up subletting a gay man's apartment, and we actually talked about whether it was safe to stay in this apartment.
Yeah.
So, from 1985 to 2005, let's just, like think of the journey of open-mindedness that happened in the entire country. But San Francisco was on the leading edge of a lot of those changes, and that's the time period I was living there. So it dramatically changed my outlook.
Mhm. And did some of that involve the beginning the use of psychedelics?
It did. That summer. So I came out with my college boyfriend and we drove out and spent the summer. So I graduated in 1983. And that summer, since we were in San Francisco, we had done a mushroom journey that he had supplied. We actually did it on the day of my last exam, so I was done with school,
Uh-huh.
and this was his treat, and I was like, okay, sure. And we had a very fun, very silly, loving experience. But then he wanted, because we were in San Francisco, he wanted to have the San Francisco experience, the pure psychedelic experience. So he wanted to try LSD. And yeah, I talked about this in my first episode. That was a big no for me. I had been raised with the fear that if you did LSD, you would, fly out a window and, kill yourself. And there would be DNA damage. And I mean, just there was a lot of misinformation that was put out into the world especially around LSD that I had totally, that was my understanding of it. So anyway, he did talk me into it, and we had a beautiful, incredible experience, and really one of my most transformative psychedelic journeys. And
How
that
would you describe it as being transformative? What happened to you or your consciousness?
Well, the first thing was that, I'm not kidding. We locked the windows, okay? Like just in case. Something we went crazy. And so that was some of the feeling that I went into it, and I came out just knowing, oh, this is a beautiful substance. This is this
Wait,
this
lock the windows because of that fear that maybe you jump out of a window when you take
yes.
LSD?
Yes.
Uh-huh. So you had that
Seriously.
fear,
Yes.
even still, you were able to have just a wonderful experience.
Exactly. So I mean, and LSD is my favorite medicine. So it felt like a coming home in my body.
Mm.
It felt like, and as a matter of fact, that's one of the things that became clear. It was like, oh, everything they've said has been a lie. Meaning everything that they had said about LSD was, I just that I just had that knowing, and then everything relaxed and there were no concerns about it. It was just a, I don't know what our dose was because I wasn't in charge at the time. And by the way, I always recommend that everybody know their dose. Ask who's giving it to you, and then look it up and know what that dose is. But my guess is it was probably around 100 micrograms. And it was a beautiful, loving, connecting thing between the two of us. We made a pact that no matter what, we would always be friends, and we still are to this day. So there was that. Our connection was transcending that moment and would continue. But it started the process of learning to trust my own inner knowing instead of what I was told. And that was an opening of a
Sure,
boundary. Yeah.
sure. No. Well, it's very interesting too that, because these days, and I think you would recommend to people that they do a good bit of preparation, that if they have
Absolutely.
fears, they really explore those fears and so forth before doing it.
Yes.
And yet, you had that experience and it actually was a positive transformation that went went further
And
after
you're
that.
right. It could have absolutely, I could have stayed stuck in the fear. It could have been a negative, a whole, negative overlay. I mean, the first thing we had laid out all this food, all these snacks, et cetera. And so the first thing we did was like put all that away. We're like, okay, we don't want any of this.
Going food, yeah. I remember my
But
first LSD experience. It wasn't as pleasant as yours. And I looked at a bowl of what was lying on the table, and what is that? And somebody said, that's food. What is that? You know, so
yeah, you were on a much bigger dose,
I was on a big dose and I wasn't prepared.
you
And
know.
that's a whole nother story. Yeah, right.
Right. And
Yeah.
that's a big part of why I'm doing this podcast is to teach people. And so so know your dose. It's like, well, I
Yeah.
don't know what my dose is. Well, research.
Yeah. Yeah, I saw that and I downloaded your safety protocols, or what do you call it, to document
Oh,
them?
yes. If you go to my website, which is this is my little plug, psychedelicdivas.com, I will exchange for your email. I will give you my psychedelic safety tips, including what to do when things go wrong.
Right.
And it's like 20
We'll get
pages.
more to that too. I think it's very important what you're doing with that. Um, so would you say that that experience was a spiritual experience?
I would say yes at this point, looking back, but I wouldn't have called it
At
that
the
at the time.
time, you wouldn't have called it
No,
that. Yeah.
no. What I would say now,
Mhm.
I would say that psychedelics were part of my soul path,
Mhm.
and that they were obviously going to be important to my life. And this first experience was initiating me into that, and that's why that message came. Oh, everything they've said has been a lie. In other words, trust your inner knowing on this. Don't stay in the fear. I mean, of course, there's all kinds of things to fear around psychedelics. Yes, but to me, it was an initiatory. This is an important path for you, and you should keep exploring this.
So did it immediately become kind of a path for you that you began to use different psychedelic substances for the purpose of continuing your journey or enhancing your consciousness, or
Well, I
what
did
does
use it
that say?
to continue my journey, but not so much from a consciousness perspective. So that boyfriend, we then went on to try MDMA together, and we used mushrooms quite a bit for fun and recreation. And I spent the next 10 years recreational. I was clubbing, I was going hiking, I was creating parties with friends, outings to, downtown San Francisco, like, to explore different things. I mean, I spent 10 years like just fully solidly having a blast in the recreational zone, and I learned a ton. I learned about, dosing. I learned about being able to navigate the world and still and while high, like without staring and saying, wait, what, this is food, what is food, like so that was a big part of knowing our dose. I was became the default safety person guide. Oh, go ask Carla, she'll know. And so became a little bit of a teacher. Like people would be like, well, like how much should I, the mushrooms? I'm like, no, don't take that one. That's too much.
Mm.
And I feel like I did a lot to kind of keep our community safe, and but that was all learning, not from there was no internet, and we were learning a lot on the fly, and I certainly had no concept of setting. I mean, we were lucky on so many levels, but we had good instincts. We
Uh-huh.
had good instincts, and I had good, solid, fairly fairly healthy friends, so
Mhm.
that we weren't dealing with mental health breakdowns or crises, or so. I mean, just lucky on many, many,
Nobody jumped
many
out of a
levels.
window. Yeah.
Nobody jumped out of a window.
Mhm.
So that was the first decade. I didn't start using them for consciousness exploration until I had a dear friend who had been a Mormon. He had left the church, but he was a spiritual seeker. And I turned him on to mushrooms, and then I turned him on to MDMA first and then mushrooms. And he found Terrence McKenna. And so we went to listen to Terrence in the East Bay. And I was like, okay, that's interesting. And this friend was very taken with
You weren't
Terrence.
necessarily blown away, it sounds like.
I wasn't blown away by Terrence.
Uh-huh.
But again, this is my first crossing into these or something more. These
Mhm.
substances might have something more to offer than just a fun night in town. And this friend then, by following Terrence, went to the Palenque conference, the ethnobotanical conferences in Palenque, Mexico, that Terrence had co-created. And he met Ralph Metzner there. And when he came back, he had gone down, in his words, I went down there, like Terrence, 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 but I came back, Ralph, Ralph, Ralph. And when he started telling me about the work that he had been doing with Ralph,
Uh-huh.
I went, I want that.
Uh-huh.
And
What was
he
it
introduced
about
me.
that at that point before you'd experienced it? And we'll talk about this, but I'm also someone who spent many years working with Ralph. And for those who don't know, Ralph Metzner was one of the three figures at Harvard that were much lesser known to the mainstream world, I think. There was Tim Leary, who became a counterculture icon and charismatic figure. Ram Dass, who was then Richard Alpert, and it became probably one of the people who brought spirituality, particularly Eastern spirituality, to this country more than anyone else, Ram Dass. And the third was Ralph Metzner, who went on a very different kind of journey and passed on very powerful teachings to those people who did have the gift, really, a blessing to have worked with him. And so, Carla, you met Ralph, but what was it about that you even heard about him that
Oh,
intrigued you at this place you were in, where you were having lots of fun with psychedelics?
so this is where I start talking soul path.
Yeah.
So first of all, when this friend went to Palenque and didn't invite me or tell me about it, I was really mad. I was like, what? Like, I turned you on to all this stuff. How could you not have told me about this conference? So I made sure that I went to that conference the next year, and actually I went to the next 2 years, and then Terrence had passed, and they stopped doing it. So I was irritated at this friend,
Mhm.
and I was reading a Tom Robbins book with my mother. My mother and I were traveling in Southeast Asia,
Uh-huh.
and I was in a hotel room. I'm reading this Tom Robbins book. I'm not sure which one it was, but in it he lists all of these teachers, and I knew like Terrence was one of them, and I knew maybe I don't know three, maybe there was like a dozen names, and I knew maybe like three or four, but they were all really interesting people, and I was like, okay, I need to find out who the rest of these people are, and
This
and
was
then
Tom Robbins' book,
Tom Robbins,
a novel
the
that
novel, yeah, the
yeah,
novel.
he named
And
all
he
these.
I think it's because he's talking about the University of Timbuktu, and
Uh-huh.
this is who teaches there. And
Yeah.
I don't know if any of it's true because it's of
Yeah.
course a fictional book, right? But he was dropping breadcrumbs, and
Mhm.
I picked up the breadcrumbs, and I said to myself, because I was irritated with this friend, I said, well, whatever this friend does next, I'm going to do. So I came back from this trip, and I called him up, and I said, okay, what are you doing next? And he said, oh, well, this weekend I'm going to do a workshop with Michael Harner, who wrote The Way of the Shaman. And I'm like, okay, shamanism. Well, I said that whatever he's doing next, I'm going to do. So I was blessed to be able to take this workshop with Michael Harner, who is another icon in the world of,
Yeah, I also did some workshops with him. Sure. But
yeah,
could I come
transformational
back to,
journey.
did this relate to the Tom Robbins book? Was Michael Harner mentioned?
No,
Or-
it was just I was reading that book. It made me think about the since Terrence was in it, it made me think about that this friend had gone to this conference. It reminded me that I was irritated with him. And it told me to, the little voices in my head were like, you should do
He's
whatever this friend's going to do
following
next.
the thread of where your mind went, took you.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry. But it was literally that weekend. I came home from
Oh,
this trip with my mother, and it was that weekend. So it was a little, drop into my consciousness, like, hey, call this friend, find out what he's doing.
yeah.
So during lunch, we were talking about our process in this workshop. It was Shamanism 101.
Mhm.
And
Yeah. Finding, going down in the underworld and finding your power animal.
right. And this is sober, obviously.
Is this in Berkeley?
This was in San Francisco.
Oh, okay.
But yes, you're learning
I
how
thought I
to.
might have been there because I was at the ones in Berkeley.
Oh, funny. Yes. So this would have been 1996.
Uh-huh.
And
Oh,
it wasn't, yeah, I think it was in San Francisco. And so this is sober, but this is using a lot of this is starting to use the technique of that we're using with psychedelics. And Michael Harner was certainly psychedelically informed, but this was classic shamanism using a drum as the through line to
rhythmic
navigate.
drumming to
Hmm.
induce the altered state. Yeah.
Exactly. So my friend and I were discussing what had happened, our experiences had been, because you're journeying four different people in the training, and he was just way better at it than I was. And I said, "Well, how come you're so much better at this than I am?" And he said, "Oh, I've been working with this guy," and which was Ralph Metzner.
This arouse things. Yeah.
And so he said, I've been working with this guy and I've been having these psychedelic journeys with him. And like I had this one where all of my ancestors, I could see them all come, all behind me and, on both lineages, both sides and this. And I was like, wait a minute.
Mhm.
I've never had that kind of experience.
Mhm.
I want that.
Mhm.
Are you, like that's
Mhm.
possible? As I said, I was a 10-year, the 10-year party girl with these substances.
You mostly tripped with your eyes open.
Yes.
Yeah, that's one thing.
Yes.
And there was no guide
No.
suggesting, yeah, go here, go
Nope.
there. Right.
Nope. We were all talking. There was music. It was always an experience. I never did it on my own, and it was always an experience with friends. Like, oh, we're gonna have this party. Oh, we're gonna go, do this hike. Like, I was one of the major creators of what we were going to do, and
Yeah.
then, the substances were layered into that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting how, when the eyes, what we call our physical eyes are open, we don't have our inner eye looking
Right.
inward, right?
I
So at least it's
I
very
had
tricky
zero.
to do
I
that.
had zero inner eye.
So closing your physical eyes
Hmm.
can begin to allow you to look inside and do things like explore ancestors or all the things that,
All of the things that Ralph taught us.
yeah,
I didn't know any of that was possible. And that workshop with Michael Harner opened
yeah,
me to different ways of exploring consciousness.
right,
That
right.
was that crossed the boundary right there. That workshop, not Ralph, which obviously, Ralph is my major teacher for 22 years.
Mhm.
But that moment that where you're working with journeying and asking for spirit guides to, provide answers and doing that sober and learning those processes, that's what crossed me over into a spiritual consciousness perspective with psychedelics.
Mhm. Yeah. and then hearing that you could do that with the amplification of psychedelics with this
Right.
guy, Ralph Metzner, who
Right.
leads these circles or works with
Yes,
people in that way,
exactly.
you know.
But
Yeah.
there is again those places of the soul is dropping you breadcrumbs. And so for
Uh-huh.
me, that first LSD journey was a breadcrumb. Terrence was a breadcrumb, but he was a smaller one.
Uh-huh.
And then going to that conference, like being upset that I hadn't, been invited with my friend, to go to that conference. That was a big breadcrumb, and I went to it for the next 2 years. Michael Harner was a breadcrumb,
Mhm.
and then, but the biggest breadcrumb was how my body reacted when my friend told me about the work he was doing with Ralph. And as I said, everything I just said, I want that.
Mhm. Yeah. Just to explain for anyone who may not be picking up on the metaphor of the breadcrumbs, that I think what you're saying is that your soul or your higher self or your spirit is dropping into your mind clues that will take you where you really need to go. That
Yes,
sort of like the way
spiritual breadcrumbs. That
spiritual
that
take you to your spirit on your spiritual path.
Yeah, I think my soul,
Pick up
um,
that breadcrumb and then,
yeah,
oh,
my
there's another
soul,
one, and then there's
right,
another. Yeah,
knew that I needed to make a journey from
yeah,
that sort of very straight upbringing that I had
yeah.
to you know using these tools first of all to using these tools and then to using them with such a spiritual connection to consciousness and deeper awareness. And so I had to make that journey.
Mhm.
And I think my soul dropped these little spiritual breadcrumbs into my path.
Yeah.
And I could feel the way they landed in my body. I was like, oh, I should pay attention to this.
You
I need to
make
do
choices
this.
based on that.
Yes.
And you weren't always conscious that
No,
that's where it was going to take you. Like I was very different journey to get to Ralph, but
I would love to hear.
I saw in one of the underground papers, even Berkeley Barb or one of those in those days, that little notice that said Maps of Consciousness Retreat with Ralph Metzner, who I'd never seen or anything. I'd seen Tim Leary and I'd seen Ram Dass, and thought, well, this is the third guy I want to follow up on that.
So you knew you either did you read about who he was or did you know that he was the third
I
guy?
only knew that he was one of those three at Harvard,
Okay.
so that he was like a very psychedelically informed
Right.
person.
So when you
And
read this, you were like, oh, I know who this guy is. Okay.
kind of, I'm like,
Kind
just
of.
do that. That's all I knew. I
Right.
didn't know anything about how he was or who he was. And when I first
Right.
met him, I was very unimpressed because he looked extremely straight, and I was very identified with the hippie culture.
Right.
And his hair was short, very closely cropped. Yeah, no beard. Didn't have any of the paraphernalia you're supposed to have. And he seemed very rather stiff, actually, to tell you the truth.
Yes.
And
Very Germanic.
yeah, and so yeah, at this retreat, it's kind of a long story, but at one of the sessions, I dropped a little LSD, and he introduced this Agni yoga work, which is what
Mhm.
he was just beginning to get involved in school in Southern California, and
Yes.
completely. That was like a whole loaf of bread. That was
Right.
that
There you
was
go. But
yeah.
I love that you took some LSD with it so that it wasn't just like, oh, is this working? Is this not? It's like you were like, yes.
Well, it's like I took the LSD because in those days it was kind of like to take a somewhat small, moderate amount of LSD was a way to see more clearly
Hmm.
whatever I was looking at and people. And so when I didn't particularly resonate with him, I wanted to just take a deeper look. Something had me do that.
Right. See,
Uh,
that's the breadcrumb.
yeah. And then I got this experience of this whole spiritual path, this whole discipline called Agni Yoga, which he, as you know, integrated into the work he did later with psychedelics. Um, anyway, that was, yeah, an introduction that was life-changing for me. So
Well,
you
when
began
did you
work.
first that you that so
Remember, this is
you were
about you.
I know, but but I'm so
Go ahead.
curious. Well, so you were tripping the first time you worked with Ralph. I love that. But when did you first have a psychedelic experience with Ralph, where he knew about it?
He knew about it then after I went up to him afterwards. Because the first experience was I went in and there was a whole group.
Hmm.
Nobody was doing psychedelics at the retreat, as far as I know. And the experience was very, very powerful. And I went up to him afterward and I said, well, how do you follow up with this? Where is this? And so he thought for a minute where it looked like he went and disappeared. He went into this kind of invisible place, and then he came back down and said, "Okay, well, come over here." And he took me into this little cabin, and he did it one to one with me while I was still under the influence of
Oh,
the
wow.
LSD.
Uh-huh.
And that was when it really felt like a total transformation of every cell of my body kind of uh, becoming imbued with or freed with this inner light that he had been talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so yeah, that's just a little bit of my story, but back to you. So you started working with Ralph. You started
I,
attending.
well, first I worked with him a little bit as a therapist because I needed to, have his level of comfort before he would offer me to do a one-on-one session with him.
uh,
So I worked with him for a little bit as a therapist, and then he, offered a one-on-one psychedelic guided therapy session, and that was 1996, and that was beautiful, powerful, really, really transformative because that's the first time. It's the first time eye shades, right? That's the first time that and so he's asking me questions, and then I'm going in, and I'm having, my whole experience, and finding, finding these deeper answers, and seeing all these deeper connections to things. So this is my first time where, everything is sort of like, in terms of what psychedelics can really provide. This is the first time I'm fully embodying and seeing and visualizing. I mean, all of it. It's all coming, into my awareness in that one-on-one session.
uh,
And then he invited me. That was in the spring of 1996, and he invited me to come to a group in the fall. And so I did that group. The reason that I stayed with him as a teacher for 22 years is that Ralph guided during the groups. So I know that the traditional
that's
right
what I
now
was
is,
going to ask you to talk about a little bit, is that
yeah,
he has a very different, or had a very
very,
different
very
approach
highly interventional.
to sitting for psychedelics than just about anybody else.
Yep.
I know you're very wired into the psychedelic world, and I would
Hmm.
ask you about that. Do you find anybody doing anything on
There's
that
a there's
order?
just I only know of a very small amount of people who continued his lineage.
They worked with him. In other words,
They worked with him. But yes, you're right. So I don't know outside of Ralph's lineage anyone who's doing that, like,
so
who
could
came up
you
with it on their
describe
own.
for everybody, mostly people who don't know, what
Right.
is the difference? What is the range of ways that people are doing these things that you know of, and what was Ralph's approach?
Well, it's sort of like an intervention scale. So the least amount of intervention is you alone in your closet in the dark. Okay, that's the least amount of input. And then if you add music, that's an intervention. If you come out into the room and there's other things happening, that's an intervention. If you have someone sitting with you, that's an intervention. So you can see, Ralph was all the way to the opposite end of the scale, because what he ended up creating and doing was, I mean, Ralph was he was a mapper of consciousness, and he was so brilliantly well read. And so what he did is that he created these guided journeys that he would take us on, And so together he called it a spirit canoe. So like the spirit canoe, we'd all, come be on the same spirit canoe. So we're all having our individual experience, but we're on the same spirit canoe. And this is where the spirit canoe was going, where the guided meditations are leading. And I mean, he invoked Norse mythology, ancestral lineages. We did deep mother-father work. We did work where he explored this realm that he had termed the soul council, where the soul is about to incarnate and it is surrounded by all the other souls who are going to have the most impact in your life. And you're looking, it's a life review. You're looking at the life you're saying yes to, and you are making the agreements with your soul buddies. Okay, you're going to be my father this lifetime. You'll be my sister. We'll get married. Et cetera. Like the overall parameter of your life is being set in this soul council, and then you incarnate and forget everything. And that's why I refer to the breadcrumbs, because I think the soul instills in each of us these little memories, these places. You're supposed to, there's something more. You're supposed to be doing this. This isn't quite right. This doesn't feel good, and so that's how we make our, that's how the soul directs us, is whether things feel aligned or exciting or, negative or fearful. And
So
I
Carla,
learned all of that from Ralph
uh-huh,
in psychedelic space.
right, right. So just to put it out there, I mean, some people argue that to intervene in that way is to suggest or even manipulate a
Yep.
person's consciousness. And that if in fact it's true that the soul um, drops these breadcrumbs, if you give the person the medicine and you have just a safe setting, they're going to find that themselves.
Yes.
That's the
Yes.
that's the general attitude
Absolutely.
and approach to
And
psychedelic
I
therapy that most people are doing, and even in the underground.
I
And
fully support that. I fully support that. I think that's the way especially for most people, that's how it should be. But I had opportunities I had other, Ralph introduced me to one of my other teachers, who's still alive, and an incredible wisdom keeper. And she created a women's group that I was part of for the next several years. And there was no guiding in that group, but I mean, she held impeccable feminine space. I learned so much from how she held circles. And I did have that opportunity to just, let the medicine, it's just me and the medicine, right? And music. And so I had those experiences, and they were profound, and I 100% support this traditional way of working with the medicine. But for me, when I went to Ralph's groups, I was like, I'm being guided to places and into things that I didn't know existed. And I couldn't have gotten there on my own. And that was the value to me. Now this very first group that I went to, so Ralph was just starting to do this. So I think most people had been in his group, prior. And he actually, he provided, you could have your choice of the medicine. He stopped doing that because I think he wanted the group to all be in more of a psychic alignment. But there was a choice of medicine that night, and I took ayahuasca because I had never had it before, and I think most people took mushrooms. And he actually said, "I'm going to try something out here, and you can, tune it out, or you can follow along." I mean, it was like optional. And the next day in the integration circle, there was a woman who had been in his groups before. She was actually sort of a famous tantra teacher, and she was like, "I hated it. That was terrible. I like." I never saw her again in any of Ralph's groups.
She
So
didn't like the fact that he was talking
he
and
did not like.
saying,
She did not like that he was
yeah,
interrupting her
suggesting
journey.
things and so forth. Yeah, I've
She found it
experienced
annoying.
circles where that happened too.
Yeah. So that was a so there it was not for everyone.
Yeah,
And you're right. Ralph is he's
yeah,
inserting a worldview. He's
yeah.
inserting this place that the Soul Council exists.
Yeah.
But it's, to me, it was the soul council real? I don't, I'll tell you, on the other side, right?
Mm.
Or I won't if there is no other side. But it was a framework
Mhm.
to hang a life structure on. And I didn't have to like fully believe the soul council exists in order to get benefit from the framework.
Mm. Mm.
And in order to look at something and say, oh, to call forth on a soul level important people in my life and say what was our agreement,
Mm.
and to feel and to get an answer,
Mhm.
and to feel the resonance of that, like that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so, whether it's true or not, I was able to get skills that helped me deepen my knowledge of my personal knowledge of myself, my relationships, and my engagement actually with the world. So
Yeah. Oh, Ralph was he promoted the idea of radical empiricism, which I think he got from William James.
I'm sorry, radical.
Empiricism. Empiricism
Mhm.
is the scientific method essentially, which is that you make an observation and then you form a hypothesis, and then you basically come to say, okay, this is what seems true, at
Mhm.
least for now, the best truth that I know that I can believe. And the thing is, what William James suggested and what Ralph really applied very strongly is that you can do that with subjective experience. You could go inside,
Mhm.
and if another person goes inside and they have the same experience, that's an observation that could be called objective. Just like you see that tree out there, I see that tree out there, that tree
Right.
is really there, And so these soul council experiences tended to validate because people really, in the experience, had that experience. It was real.
Everybody came back with something.
Yeah. So that was my sense.
Yes.
Ralph also came to the psychedelic guiding world after having spent 10 years in this group that taught this Agni Yoga approach,
Mhm.
where we would sit in group formation and our teacher, Russell, would guide these experiences. And he was talking, guiding these
Oh, okay.
meditations. He
Got
wasn't
it.
doing like mindfulness teachers tend to do,
Right.
just open, be aware, and then whatever happens, happens. It was like an intervention. He was like guiding us to these soul places,
So that's where that came from.
and then
Okay.
he brought that together with psychedelics.
Yes.
That was the thing. Yeah,
And I don't think at that time, I don't think anyone else on the planet was doing what Ralph was doing.
yeah,
And so I was like, I'm sticking with this.
yeah. And as you said, there were people who didn't like
No, right,
doing and
right.
had philosophical objections to it.
Hmm.
It was intervention in the sense that it was interfering with the
Right.
person's real, genuine journey. And I think it took a very special kind of consciousness to be able to offer those suggestive ways of focusing your attention without it being
Yes.
controlling the person's mind,
I
reminding
agree.
people.
There had to be
He
a
really
certain
was
level of,
offering you, take a
yes,
look at this, see if it's true for you. Be curious.
yes.
Yeah,
And I think there was a certain level of, I mean, he obviously curated who was in the groups. So there was a certain level of emotional intelligence or I mean, like just psychic health or whatever. Like, I mean,
self-selection. Yeah,
and so, and most people were seekers and looking for this sort of additional level of awareness and intervention. But Alan, I want to talk about how we know each other, because I think that was we're
we were
really,
in
really
those circles together for many times.
well. And those circles, I mean, it wasn't just one night.
Yeah,
Ralph was creating 5, 6 day,
right.
experiences where each day there'd be a different medicine. So, I've talked about how it felt like my guides were like, okay, we'll show her this, and then we'll build on it, and then the next night we'll add more information, and it felt like it would just kept growing and building within my own awareness. But I'm curious, what was it like for you to come to those groups?
Oh, it was always a very powerful, transformative experience. I mean, each night, like you said, he would use a different medicine or offer a different medicine, different set of teachings, and it always informed my life more deeply. They were one of the things that I appreciated about that approach was that that process that he would guide us through was a teaching that you then could explore, or I would find
Hmm.
myself
Hmm.
exploring afterwards.
Right.
So,
Right.
yeah, like you didn't mention it, but like the six realms that the Buddhist wheel of life
Hmm.
has, or the soul council, those were things that I continued to try to work with. And then as a therapist, sometimes could share with or help. Because I would, and as a psychotherapist,
Yes.
I integrated meditative teachings and inner guided processes with people, just
Well, I
inner
use
exploration. Yeah.
the same thing. I use it in my coaching,
Using it as
and
a
I
coach.
use it. All my coaching is focused on helping people through like the transformational times in their life. So that can be a divorce, it could be a job change, a midlife crisis, a
Mhm.
psychedelic experience.
Yeah.
And I use these frameworks to help people to try to understand what's going on. What is this shift? Because sometimes, if you're not in flow with shifts like that, they're painful, they're hard, it's really difficult. And so,
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah, so I use a lot of what Ralph taught me as tools in my coaching to help people, understand what is this sort of bigger thing that they're going through, not just put a bigger framework around it.
Yeah. Yeah. I wanted to give some time to you for you to talk a little bit about your new mission, your new project, which is the podcast. And because I really honor the intention that you have expressed about it on your website and so forth. So I wanted to ask you to share a little bit about why are you doing this and what's it
Why
in
why are you doing
the
this?
shorter form, not the long story
Yeah.
of how hard it was to get to do it, but that's on the website,
Oh yeah.
on the
Yeah.
YouTube.
If you want to know the long form, that's my first episode because it was hard. It was
But
hard.
why? What's the intention? Like we ask
Well,
for.
the long and the short is that this was handed to me by my guides in a psychedelic journey, and I was shown that it was important for me to do this, whether I wanted to do it or not.
Mhm,
And the reason it's important is that the psychedelics, we're having, obviously, they're calling it a psychedelic renaissance, this resurgence,
mhm,
this explosion. It is exploding worldwide again, and because of the work that we've done with Ralph and with my other teacher, who was trained by Leo Zeff, the secret chief, and then other elder psychedelic community in the Bay Area is my community. So I have a lot of knowledge from those past 40 years, and so I was just shown that it was important to try to steer this ship because it's going to get rocky. It's going to get messy, and the best way that I could do that is to try to keep a feminine, and I don't mean gender, but
uh-huh,
our feminine nature. So that's intuition, our ceremonial, our spiritual side, nurturing, compassion, caring. Those are all the feminine. We all have, we have both a feminine and masculine aspects to each of us. And it was those feminine traits that I was shown if could be needed to be applied to the psychedelic world as it, kind of comes online with this medical model and possibly legal change in legal status, maybe not. So the tagline for the podcast, which is psychedelic divas, and it's the divine feminine. That's what divas comes from. It's the Latin for the divine feminine, and trying to keep us in our inner divinity and our inner knowing, like listening to those breadcrumbs and honoring them. So it's the tagline is demystifying the world of psychedelics through the wisdom of the divine feminine. And I, because I've been in the Bay Area in the psychedelic world for 40 plus years, I'm blessed to really know a lot of amazing women who have been keepers of the psychedelic flame, or the new ones who are picking it up and carrying this out into the world. And so some of it's my teaching, but most of it is me interviewing, just like this, the psychedelic feminine leaders,
yeah,
and trying to look at this world that's about to really, I think, really explode. And how do we keep ourselves safe?
Yeah.
And there's just a big focus on harm reduction, which is why I have that psychedelic safety guide, including what to do when things go wrong. Which, if you go to psychedelic divas, that's divas with an S .com, I will exchange it for your email. But the for me, the focus of this is safety and harm reduction, and then uh, beyond that, it's teaching the sacred, the ceremonial, the fun, all the various ways that these medicines can be used to keep people safe while they're doing it.
Yeah. Yeah, I watched your interview, just your most recent interview with Melissa Whippo,
Hmm.
and yeah, just the idea that she's exploring the use of ketamine legally uh,
Hmm. Right.
to work with women and exploring just a broader sense of what she's doing personally with
Hmm.
the idea that women can use it for prenatal issues,
Yes.
postpartum depression, menopause, menstrual.
Yep, we were that's this the it's that whole episode is about women's health, and so a lot, so it's from menstruation to menopause. What are the various, there's no studies yet, right? Nobody's looking at it, so it's only our own stories. But they are starting to do, because ketamine is legal, they are starting to do some studies, and she actually did the first study to test whether ketamine would be safe for lactating mothers. And it turns out that it's a very, 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 very small percentage that's passed on. And ketamine has a half-life of 12 hours. So if you were concerned about it, you could pump and not use that breast milk for 12 hours, and then safely come back
Uh,
to which is
Great to
which is a
know.
big deal, because the other option is ongoing SSRIs,
Right,
which
which
which are
definitely get
right.
passed on. Yeah. So psychedelics are exploding. You're concerned about safety, as am I, and where it's all going. There is this idea, and certainly in the 60s, when psychedelics were exploding then,
Hmm.
um, there was like a culture that was very, very recognizable. You
Right.
knew by the length of a guy's hair,
Right.
clothes that people wore,
Right.
or where they congregated. I mean,
Yes.
I came to California to go to Haight-Ashbury because I had
Hmm.
got turned on with LSD.
Right.
Um, in every town, in every city, there were little enclaves, like Greenwich Village or Haight-Ashbury in big sense. And uh, these days, it's very different. It's very
Yes.
spread out. It's very decentralized. I think a lot of people are doing things in very small groups or just individually.
Hmm.
Um, What's your sense of how an evolving psychedelic culture, if that we can talk about that, or a society that's influenced in a positive way by psychedelics, as
Right.
well as if you want to comment on how it might be influenced in a negative way, is
Now
evolving.
let's look at the positive. There's enough negative going on. So in 2021, we're still, hanging out at home for the most part with COVID. And I spent that year on the Clubhouse app, and it was a new app, and it was a new social media app, and it was all audio. So you could listen to people, and you could be engaging with people. And I joined that app, and I had a bunch of psychedelic friends who, once you join the app, it says, "Oh, look, who else is here?" And it connects you to everybody. And I
Uh-huh.
had a bunch of psychedelic friends, and they were all like, "Hey, we're hanging in this clubhouse. Within Clubhouse, there are clubhouses, and called the Psychedelic Clubhouse, come." And so people would host rooms with topics, and there would be speakers, and there would be audience people, and you could raise your hand and ask questions. And, I kept getting pulled up on stage. It's like, "Oh, Carla's here. Like she'll know, ask her." And because these friends knew that I had some knowledge. And I ended up hosting my own rooms for the next year. And I often did it with two other women. And the most common room we hosted was preparation, intention, and integration. And so I did that for a year. And got followers, and and it was fun. And I learned from that, and that was 2021. I learned the global explosion of psychedelics. I mean, the like India was coming on like strong. The Middle East. I had all these followers from the Middle East. Russia, South America. I mean, it was everywhere. I actually hosted a room one time. I said, okay, only people from foreign countries, can come up. And but what I want to hear your take in your country of what's the psychedelic scene, experience, culture. And I mean, I think we were all blown away by it's everywhere. And that's when it came to me that, and I have this on my website, the genie's not going back in the bottle, and the bottle's been blown up. It's been blown to smithereens. Like, you can't put the psychedelic genie back in the bottle. It's not going to happen. It's everywhere. And people can now know that they can grow their own mushrooms. I mean, what's that? So I was amazed and horrified by what I learned on Clubhouse, because the level of questions that people were coming to us with it was very scary to me that
Well,
they
tell me, you did say you wanted to be positive, but you can't help but talk about that. So
well
what were you horrified about and what was scary?
that's why we did the rooms, was to teach, right? So that was the positive.
What was the scary part?
There was a guy who came once, and he said, has anyone ever done a group with 8 people? And like everybody was like, like the people who were hosting the room with the knowledge were kind of like, what? What do you mean? And he said, and someone asked him a question like, well, what are you asking about? He said, well, I've been hosting psilocybin journeys in my garage for up to 4 people every week. And I'd like to, it's a lot of work, et cetera. And I'm just wondering, is it possible? Would it be safe? Is it okay if I had 8 people instead of 4?
Um,
And so,
he
like,
didn't know anything about what he was really doing.
he didn't know anything.
Yeah, that's and that's what, that's the worry, that people
Yes.
are entering into this. uh,
Right.
I'm a shaman, I'm a guide, and,
Yes.
and
So there's that.
yeah.
I also hosted a room once on come tell your stories of what went wrong. And then we analyzed them. So like, and pretty much across the board, the major reasons that something goes wrong is that someone's in a wrong setting, where they don't feel safe, they can't get out, or or they're with the wrong people, which is part of setting, or the dose. So those are the sort of two major areas. And so just teaching that just those two things, to have awareness of the setting and the people that you're going to be with, and to really know what your dose is.
And I would add the lack of preparation,
Yes.
the lack of preparation.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yes.
even if there's not guiding during the session, which
Mm-hmm.
generally there's not, and it's probably
Right.
a good idea that it's not, unless somebody really has learned how to do that, I suppose. Uh, then, it is fair to offer possible scenarios of what can happen during a session and where you could go and what might
Mm-hmm.
if you explore. So yeah, so good. Any are you hopeful after
Um,
learning about all of what's going on and the worldwide expansion and explosion of psychedelic, given what's happening in the world?
I am scared and hopeful. Yes.
Mhm.
I'm worried. I'm worried. Not scared. I'm worried. I think
Cautious?
there's gonna be it's gonna get messy,
Yeah.
because it's going to get messy. And that's because that's how we're going to learn. And what does messy look like? So Matthew Perry, um, drowning with ketamine. I mean,
Right.
that's so
Although that was a
so well,
misinterpretation of what really happened, right? And
no, I mean, the autopsy, he drowned. I
right,
mean,
he had other drugs in his system and
right.
didn't.
But so there's an awareness here. So that's messy,
Yeah,
right? But
yeah,
now there's an awareness that other people might not have had. Hey, I'm not going to do a large dose of ketamine in water.
and going
Now,
about
you and I
that
knew that
himself.
because
Yeah.
that's how John Lilly died, but they don't know, the new crew doesn't know who that is or what happened. And so Matthew Perry So that's what I'm saying. I'm worried and hopeful. So what that's a total tragedy that Matthew Perry died that way. But there's now this awareness that wasn't present.
Yeah,
So that's what I mean by it's going to get messy.
yeah.
But I think ultimately I'm hopeful.
And you and I, to some extent, see ourselves as having a role in helping steer
Yes.
um, it's a very decentralized set of boats that are
Yes.
going on the waters, the oceanic waters of consciousness.
Yes. And while I did resist this, I did say yes to it, and I think it's important. So that's what I'm doing.
I think it's important too, Carla, and I really want to support the work you're doing and
Thank you.
really glad to have had this time with you together.
Well, and thank you for sharing. I know that you're like, oh, this isn't about me, but I wanted to hear some rough stories that I didn't know. So thank you.
Okay, well, we'll wrap up for now, and thank you again, and thank you everybody who's watching this, whenever you're watching, wherever you're watching, or just listening. And I will post information to contact Carla or learn about psychedelic divas and her work, or also as a coach, on where the YouTube is visible or the podcast is available. Thanks again, Carla.
Oh, thank you, Alan. It was a total
Okay.
pleasure. I thoroughly enjoyed it.